Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about this paper called Optimal Fiscal Consolidation under Frictional Financial Markets. After a sharp rise in spreads during the sovereign debt crisis, European countries face a key trade-off. On the one hand, they could use fiscal policy to achieve macroeconomic stabilization in fighting off the effects of the recession. On the other hand, could engage in fiscal consolidation in attempt to reduce government debt and easing the impact on sovereign spreads. In this paper, I studied the optimal resolution of this trade-off. I consider the optimal fiscal policy problem in a currency union with frictional financial markets. I allow for a rich choice of policy instruments, including the level of government debt, as well as tax policy, such as the VAT and the payroll tax. I consider an environment with two key ingredients. First, stick prices, which gives rise to a macroeconomic stabilization motive to the social planner, who wants to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy and alleviate the inefficiencies created by the lack of demand. We do so by considering an open economy equation model as in Galimo and Jelly. The second key ingredients are endogenous spreads, which give rise to debt management motive, where the social planner wants to use fiscal policy to reduce the amount of foreign debt, easing the impact on sovereign debt spreads. This requires us to consider a frictional financial market as in Gabay majority. We derive three main lessons regarding the level of government spending, taxes, and debt. First, we find that it's not optimal to engage in stimulus spending. Second, the government should use the VAT tax in order to stimulate the economy. First, it reduces taxes and then increase it over time. Third, the overall level of taxes, sum of VAT and payroll, should rise and be front-loaded on impact. This leads to a fiscal consolidation, as this reduces the amount of government debt relative to a passive fiscal policy choice. Let's dive in and jump into the model. Households have isoelastic preferences. Consumption consists of an aggregate of domestic and foreign goods with a weight on foreign goods given by alpha. Households consume a variety of individual goods produced in country I, which is aggregated into a bundle using lessee substitution epsilon. These different bundles from different countries are further aggregated in a composite using a CS aggregator gamma. We assuming that the aggregator for individual goods is the lessee substitution for these individual goods is larger than the lessee substitution for the composite goods. Farms producing using linear technology where labor is the only input. Farms sell to domestic consumers and to foreign consumers. And they're subject to three different taxes. First, a VAT tax. Second, an export tax. Lastly, a payroll tax. Notice how this incorporates already the 40 adjustment that comes with the VAT. The VAT incides over sales of domestic goods, but not over sales to foreign consumers. Follow the literature on border adjustment and assumes that farms have stick prices on the producer prices. Therefore, consumer prices have full pass-through of taxes. So PH is the price received by the firm J. This price is sticky, and we assume that the price that the consumer faces is going to have a tax on top of that. Similar for foreign consumers regarding the export tax. You have the terms of trade, and it depends on the relative price of foreign domestic goods from domestic consumers and foreign consumers. This is the relative price for domestic consumers. Notice that due to border adjustment, it does not depend on the level of the VAT tax. Second, here's the price of foreign goods relative to domestic goods is faced by foreign investors, which is affected by the export tax. Importantly, households cannot invest in foreign bonds in this economy. We introduce international financial intermediaries that do arbitrage across different countries. These intermediaries subject to a friction as the gap de majority, where they can divert a fraction of the amount that they borrow to invest in domestic bonds. This is the problem that intermediaries face. They want to maximize the profits of this operation subject to the financial friction. This leads to a very simple demand function for domestic bonds. The parameter gamma controls the degree of financial market imperfection. When gamma equals to 0, we have the interest rate across domestic and foreign bonds are equalized, consistent with perfect financial markets. When gamma goes to infinity, we find that there's no investment in domestic bonds, and we're essentially considering autarky economy. The country is also subject to exogenous capital flow shocks that will affect the level of interest rates. So interest rates have then a domestic, an endogenous component and exogenous component. The endogenous component depends on the level of external debt, ET, and the exogenous component, IT, is going to depend on the foreign interest rates, also on the amount of capital inflows. This capital inflow is going to be therefore important in this economy. It is explained to a great extent what happened both before some of that crisis and the response after the crisis happened. Here, previous to the crisis, we saw a sharp decline in foreign interest rates and a sharp increase in the capital inflows to the country. In response to that, sovereign Southern European countries increased their amount of net external debt. This is consistent with what happens in the model in response to these capital inflow shocks. You're going to see an increase in external debt, and you're going to see a boom in these countries, and a decline in net exports, consistent with what observed in the data. However, as these capital flows change direction, countries face now a situation where they have a large initial amount of external debt, but they have to be financed in much more adverse conditions. This leads to a very sharp recession in this economy, we see in this steep price case. What we're going to do next is the optimal response to the situation. We're going to assume that the planner is going to face this high level of external debt in adverse conditions. You have to use this and to decide how to use fiscal policy. All right, so what are going to be the constraints to the actual policy problem? First, there's some equilibrium condition going to pin down certain variables, but they will not be constraints on the Ramsey problem. The intertemporal condition is going to pin down the level of the real wage. The intertemporal condition is going to pin down the path of the VAT tax. And the pricing condition, and here we're seeing the flexible price version of it, pins down the level of taxes. The implementability conditions, the constraints on the actual policy problem, here are going to be the market occurring condition for domestic goods. So domestic goods are going to be consumed by domestic consumers, the government, and foreign consumers. And here's the dynamics of external debt. Notice here the effects of financial friction. And this is basically capturing net exports. What's the actual policy problem? Is to maximize the welfare of domestic households subject to these implementability conditions. If you assume the prices are fully rigid, then you just add this constraint about terms of trade account. We find that without frictions, we obtain this benchmark where taxes are used to undo the inefficiencies created by market power as a standard in new Keynesian model. Here's the use of the export taxes. Export taxes is used to correct for the optimal trade tariff that usually applies with this type of problems. And this is the condition for the optimal provision of public goods. Okay? What we're going to consider next is what happened when we introduce our frictions. First result regards the use of stimulus spending. We define stimulus spending as deviations from this condition here for the optimal provision of public goods. And we find that regardless of the degree of stick prices or the financial friction, it's never optimal to use the stimulus spending. Stimulus spending is also always zero. However, if we limit the amount of instruments available to the government, then government spending starts to have a role again. Therefore, government spending only plays a role here when there's no instruments, other instruments available. The reason why it's suboptimal to use the spending is exactly because spending is a dominated instrument. The key inefficiency created by the recession is a positive labor wage in this economy. Here, in words of Keynes, involuntary unemployment exists when the margin to choose the labor is less than the utility of the marginal product. This is exactly the definition of a labor wage in this economy. And if you want to affect this labor wage, you can use directly something that affects this margin. You can use a payroll or VAT tax. And that's exactly what this is saying. So let's consider the optimal design of tax policy in this economy. We start with the benchmark where prices are flexible, but you still allow for the financial friction. We find that the level of taxes, the sum of the VAT and the payroll tax is equal to zero, is capped at their steady state level. And the VAT should be decreasing if you start with a high level of external debt. And the external debt slowly decline over time. Okay? So we see that it's optimal to set the declining VAT over time. Why? Because it shifts demand to the future. Okay? So then the country pays off external debt at a faster pace this way. The households do not internalize the impact that collectively they have on the interest rates. Therefore, this provides a correction for a form of pecuniary externality. All right, let's go to the other extreme now and consider the case of fully rigid prices. All right, in this case, now we have a fight between two forces. On the one hand, we have this debt management motive that we just talked about. You want to have a declining path of the VAT in order to pay off debt faster. However, now, with fully rigid prices, we have another term, that's the macro stabilization motive. All right, you have the labor wage, is the amount of inefficiency in this economy, the amount of slack in this economy. It's initially high and then slowly declining over time. So basically, this derivative here is negative, this term is positive. So that means it requires an increasing path of VAT in order to try to stimulate the economy. If taxes are low in the present, that's when the households should consume more, shifting demand to the present. The question is, which force dominates, the debt management or the macro stabilization motive? Perhaps surprisingly, we show that this trade-off is resolved not by determining the level of the financial friction gamma, but actually depends a lot on the degree of opening of the economy. In particular, if alpha goes to 1, so you give a lot of weight to the foreign good, the planner decides to align private social costs of foreign goods. And therefore, the debt management dominates. The Fed doesn't care a lot about the domestic frictions. If alpha goes to 0, there's extreme hope bias. The planner aligns the private and social cost of domestic goods. Now, planner cares a lot about domestic frictions, and the macro stabilization motive dominates. The question is, empirically, which one of these forces is more important? Well, it depends on the level of alpha. We can show that actually if alpha less than 0.5, the macro stabilization motive dominates. And empirically, this condition is easily satisfied. There's enough home bias in all of these economies such that the macro stabilization motive always dominates. Therefore, it's optimal to have an increasing path of the value-added tax. All right, so far we considered two extremes, either the case of fully rigid prices or perfectly flexible prices. Now, let's consider the problem with stick prices. Now we're going to solve the linear quadratic problem. The first few terms here are standard in New Keynesian models. These terms are there even in an economy, in a closed economy. And the last two terms are exclusive to an open economy. The constraints are, again, the market clearing condition, the path of external debt, and here the constraint that the terms of trade moves according to the internal devaluation. There's deflation, this pushes the terms of trade up in this economy. Okay? And the initial condition is you start with a high level of debt. Okay? One important aspect here, compared to what we had before, is that inflation is now costly. Isn't this going to play an important role? Okay, so what we find in this problem is that labor wage is going to be positive on impact, eventually converge to zero, and is on average positive. This property is going to be important to determine the behavior of taxes in this economy. First, let's consider what's the dynamics of the clearing variables under the optimal and passive fiscal policy. In passive fiscal policy, I mean basically keep whatever we have during the steady state level. We find that optimal policy is capable of sufficiently reducing the impact of the increasing spreads. You see that the responsive output is much milder under the optimal policy here. Interestingly, in terms of trade, depreciate at a much slower pace under the optimal policy. And again, this is crucial for the determination of taxes. Again, we have the same kind of fight between the macro stabilization and debt management motive. And we saw how usually this macro stabilization motive dominates, but now we have a new result. Regarding the optimal payroll tax or the sum of the payroll and the VAT, how it depends on what happens to the labor wage, and what depends on these parameters as well, which ultimately depend on the elasticity of substitution. If the elasticity of substitution of individual variety is larger than the elasticity of substitution of the aggregate goods, then we'll find term in brackets is positive. So on impact, have a positive labor wage, so taxes should go up. Because labor wage is positive on average, taxes should be positive on average. Because the labor wage declines over time, find that this front loading of taxes. So this may sound surprising if we were expecting the planner would try to mimic what happens during flexible prices. Notice that during flexible prices, what happened is we have a discrete drop in domestic prices to depreciate the terms of trade domestic. Okay, the planner could try to mimic this fluctual price allocation by giving the massive tax cuts to producers, to reduce domestic prices, depreciating the terms of trade and the real exchange rate. However, this logic ignores the cost of inflation. Indeed, if epsilon is relatively low, so the cost of inflation is sufficiently low, then it's optional to cut taxes. In contrast, if epsilon is relatively high, then it's optional to raise taxes, limiting the amount of deflation that happens in the economy. We find that a sufficient condition to be optimal to raise taxes in this environment is exactly that epsilon is bigger than gamma. But epsilon elasticity substitution for disaggregated goods, while gamma is elasticity substitution for aggregate bundle goods. And empirical estimates systematically point out to an epsilon substantially larger than gamma, pointing out that it's always optimal in this case to raise taxes on impact. So this is the behavior of taxes in this economy. You see that VAT tax initially decline, increases over time. The payroll increases by more than compensated the decline in the value added taxes, and labor wage increases, but much less so under the optimal policy. What's the consequence of this increase in taxes is exactly that the government debt increased by much less under the optional policy than under the passive policy. All right, in this paper, I said the optimal fiscal policy in a currency union with a macro stabilization motive and a debt management motive, and derive three main classes for fiscal policy. One, it's not optimal to use the stimulus spending. Two, VAT should be increasing over time. Three, it's optimal to raise and front load taxes, leading to a fiscal consolidation. All right, thank you.